Good morning, everybody. This is Sam Albrecht. I'm the Director of the Office of Regulatory Oversight. I work with Building Codes and Standards. And this is the Technical Advisory Committee meeting for the 21st of May. I'm going to jump into the slide deck and then we will have everybody kind of introduce themselves. We have a couple of special guests today, and I want them to know you guys and I want you to know them. So with that, let me share. You guys see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. When I go to screen share, for some reason, I can't see you guys anymore. So just, I've got Donnie as co-host. If you have items you want to place in the chat, you can. If you want to raise your hand, I'll try to catch that, or just holler at me and we'll get you back and let you ask a question. So our agenda today is, like I said, introductions. We're going to talk, spend some time this morning with Adam Berry from the Colorado Energy Office on the Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready Code. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the IECC 2021 updates. And Adam and I and Donnie have had a pre-meeting on this, so it should go fairly smoothly. And now's the time to get all the questions and concerns about all that out right now. And then we'll talk a little bit, we may talk a little bit about standardized climatic standards again, and fire suppression requirements, tiny homes, and then the ICC MBI standards adoption for 1200, 1205, and 1210. And we've got a couple guests here that are going to come back to the next meeting and give us a little more detail on that. I think we're in pretty good shape as far as moving forward with the 2021 code set adoption and versus the 2024 codes are staying on the 18 codes. We have to, as you know, by statute, go to the 2021 IECC. We might as well just make it a complete set. And then we'll wrap up this meeting. So with respect to introductions, we'll go around with staff first. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, and then we'll go back to introduction of TAC members, and then introduction of the guests that we have here today. So I told you who I am. Donnie, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Donnie Featherman, Program Manager for the Building Codes and Standards section.
Great. We also have James Trout, who's one of our plan reviewers here. James, you want to introduce yourself?
Everybody, my name is James Trout. Like Sam said, I'm a plans examiner for the state. I've done a couple of code adoptions with my last job, so I'm just kind of along for the ride and for technical advice.
Welcome to the party.
And prior to this, James was the chief building official for Elbert County. And so now we'll go to the TAC members. Nate, you want to introduce yourself?
Nate Peterson of Videra Modular, one of the new modular factories coming to Colorado, and I've been a dealer and installer for the last 20 years.
Sean?
Yeah, Sean Bruce, retailer with Clayton Homes out of Grand Junction. Been in the industry for 35-ish years. Excited to see what we come up with.
Tim?
Hi, good morning. Tim Pate, City and County of Broomfield building official. Been in code enforcement for, seems like a long time, 32 years. Contractor before that for many years. Been on the TAC for many years.
When you're got 32 years in code enforcement, there's a lot of many years in there, right? Dean?
Yeah, Dean Davitt, founding principal of EV Studio Architecture and Engineering. 20 years seems to be the theme, so I've been doing EV Studio here for about 20 years and specialize in offsite construction design.
Great. And Tracy, I see you joined us. you want to introduce yourself? Bad connection, Tracy. Tracy is the representative for the one of the representatives for the tiny home community, and is down in Colorado Springs. And then Justin.
Justin Flucky. I'm a structural engineer in the modular world here. And I guess it's kind of fate that James is on the phone because I got a question for him about a plan he reviewed of mine recently. So if you wouldn't mind talking to me afterwards, I'd appreciate it.
Sounds good. And then let's go to our guests. They are invited guests. Adam, you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Nice to see some familiar folks and meet the rest of you. Adam Berry with the Colorado Energy Office, and I lead our work on building energy codes, both the statewide model codes as well as supporting local governments and industry folks with adoption and implementation support. Glad to be here.
Great. And let's go to Leslie next.
Hi, I'm Leslie Garland. I'm Vice President of State and Local Relations for the International Code Council, and I'm one of the people working on the 1200-1205 standard.
Great. Kevin?
Good morning. I'm Kevin McCosker. I'm Vice President of Technical Resources for ICC. I work for Leslie, and I've been doing a lot of work with her on 1200 and 1205 as well. I'm former code official from the city of Las Vegas, and I have a Colorado connection. I went to high school at Evergreen, graduated from Evergreen High School.
My daughter goes to Evergreen.
In the 80s.
See, look, see, I gave you Evergreen.
Go Cougars! There you go. Great volleyball legacy at Evergreen High School, right?
Well, welcome. And it looks like, Mark, you just joined us.
Sorry about that. Can't get off the phone. You know how that is.
Yep. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Mark.
You're up, Mark.
I'm sorry. This is Mark Lindsay with ICC NTA. I'm still trying to get off the phone, Sam. ICC
you're okay.
NTA. I think I've been on the TAC committee for 10 years, forever. But glad to see everybody here. Good morning, Tawny.
Yeah, this is I'm very happy to be a part of this group. The institutional knowledge that we have here is extremely valuable. We heard 10 and 20 years. We have, as you know, with the TAC, we have representatives for manufacturers, the tiny home community, plumbing, electrical, architect, just a wide variety on that TAC, and having these folks, and we even have a energy representative also who can't make it. He thought it was a one-year assignment because I didn't tell him it was an assignment for life, like some of you guys are have been in here. And so it works out very well. As you know, we're trying to come up with new administrative rules, and we're doing some of the background work for that pretty darn soon. I've got to get some drafts out there for people to review. And although we publicly noticed this meeting, I've not sent out a request for feedback on the rules that we currently have and anything they would like to see changed. And I'm getting ready to do that. And so we may end up with a few more folks on the next couple of calls. And Charlie was able to join us. Charlie, we're not going to go around and reintroduce everybody, but you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Great. Sorry for being late. My name is Charlie Chupp. I'm the CEO of Fading West Development. We are a modular builder here in Colorado.
Fantastic. So with that, I am going to go back to sharing my slides real quick. And I assume you guys can see that. We want to talk a little bit about the guidelines and overview and scope. It'll be more important as we get more and more members of the public. Priority time is always given to the TAC members. Guests are welcome to comment by raising their hand. There's the statutory references there that we are following, and we're only addressing Colorado law and rules. And then toward the end of this, when we start digging down in the very technical part of the administrative rules and their changes, we'll ask participants to give us not say, hey, this needs to be changed, but tell us why this needs to be changed and how would you like the rule to be written, so we have a starting point for debate. So future guests, like I mentioned, ICC will have somebody at the June 25th meeting just to talk about 1200, 1205, and 1210. I've asked them to give kind of a short background. If you guys want to do it by PowerPoint, you can. Just send me your slides early so I can get them incorporated. We still are trying to, I need to validate with Colorado Fire Prevention and Control what dates that they can participate. And then we may want to spend a little more time on a focus meeting on tiny homes. And we're running out of meetings and running out of time to get these things done. So we're going to probably start going to the full hour and a half in these meetings coming up. As you know, in the past couple of meetings, we've talked about the model electric ready and solar ready code and the slide deck. The slides for those and the final published model is on that link. And Adam is going to give us more information on that today. This is the reference back to statute 24, 32, 3305, 3.5A1. On or before January 1, 2025, we shall adopt and enforce an energy code that achieves equivalent or better energy performance in the 2021 IECC and the model electric ready and solar ready code language developed for adoption by the Energy Code Board pursuant to section 2438.5-4015. And this energy code must apply to factory built structures, hotels, motels, and multifamily structures in areas of the state where no construction standards for hotels, motels, and multifamily structures exist. Now that's what our statute says. As I read this again, I find it interesting that it doesn't require non-residential here. But if we adopt the energy code, I believe, Adam, I hate to throw a fastball at you right as the start off, but let's talk about how that affects non-residential too. We will be adopting the 2021 IECC regardless, and that will be for both residential and non-residential. Notwithstanding any other provision, we can't make any changes to the energy code that is decreases the effectiveness or the energy efficiency of the energy code. We believe that in IEC 2021 that there is a requirement for a blower door test and duct testing that is required on site. And we also to resolve or to be in compliance with the solar ready code, we're going to need a new sheet in the plan set showing designated roof space and electrical conduit runs. And then electrical ready code, also another new sheet in the plan set showing electrical runs and electrical panel capacity for all electric and electrical vehicle charging capacity. And then we will have to modify Rule 2.7.7 regarding air barrier checklists. And now I am going to stop sharing again and share it over to turn it over to Adam. Adam, you want to just talk about, and Tim has done an exemplary job in setting you up for this. So Tim has done a good job of kind of, because he was a part of this development. He's explained some of the rationale and and the reasoning that went into it. But he was not bashful of saying, wait for Adam, wait for Adam. That's a good question for Adam. So just not to throw you under the bus there, Tim, but no, we appreciate your help in getting us to this point. So Adam, it's all you.
Sure, yeah, and I think Tim just wanted me to get all the hard questions. He took all the easy ones, and I get all the hard ones. Well, thanks, Sam, and everybody for inviting me here today. I think I'm mostly here. I don't think that there's much that I want to say to you, as much as I think I'm really here to just, it sounds like there have been a lot of questions that have come up where it's like, oh, that would be a good question for the energy office. And so, I'm happy to take any specific questions that you have. I'm happy to talk about any of the requirements. I'm happy to talk about the statutory implications of what we are talking about here. And Sam, that's actually really interesting that you bring up the fact that the statute itself doesn't call out commercial, which I had not noticed. I think our expectation had been that this would apply to essentially any buildings that the Division of Housing regulates with codes. And so we may have to think through what that looks like for commercial, seeing as it doesn't specifically call out for commercial. I would also note that it doesn't say it can't cover commercial either. It just doesn't say it has to. And so I think that may be a separate thing to visit, because I'm not our state's attorneys. I'm not a statute interpreter by any stretch of the imagination. And so, we could revisit that later, but I'm happy to. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a good point. I think the intent is there, even though our statute didn't pick it up. And I know we had some discussion about non-residential in this group. So now it'll be a good time to kind of flesh that out. But and I know that the way that model code is written, there's a residential section and a non-residential section, if I remember right.
There is, yeah. The entire code is intended to apply, well, provisions of the code are intended to apply both to residential and commercial. And every other application across all other directives to local governments, as well as Division of Fire Prevention and Control, and the state architect, all have them applying to commercial buildings as well as any residential buildings. So I think that either it was an oversight in the statute or it was implied and it just wasn't specifically spelled out. But I think there was the intent there that it would apply to both.
All right. So Adam's kind of opening it up for questions. You guys shoot.
Yeah, please.
So I'll refresh some of their memories.
There we go.
So there was there's something in the chat from Tim on IECC residential property applies to 3-story or less multifamily. Yeah.
Thanks. Actually, that might be a good place to start. Thank you, Tim, for bringing that up, because I think that it's important to note that in developing the model code, the Energy Code Board decided to kind of diverge from the way the IECC manages residential versus commercial. So as Tim noted in the chat, the residential chapter of the IECC covers all, single family, duplexes, townhomes, and then multifamily that is 3 stories or less. Excuse me. And then the commercial chapter of the IECC covers all multifamily that is 4 stories or greater. And so in discussing the requirements, particularly for the electric ready and solar ready code, the Energy Code Board determined that a lot of the requirements we were talking about for multifamily 3 stories or less and multifamily 4 stories or greater were the same things. And it didn't really make sense to try to differentiate those in the model code like they are differentiated in the IECC. And so in our model code, the residential provisions only apply to single family, duplexes, and townhomes. And then the commercial provisions apply to all multifamily and then all commercial occupancies as well. And I know there have been a lot of proposals before the ICC consensus committees over the years to switch that in the IECC as well, and they've all been turned down. And so just something for folks to be aware of, that does differ between the model code and the IECC as it exists. Donnie?
Yeah, I was just gonna talk about we had the prior conversation that we had with commercial structures. Let's say, the intent is to include the commercial structures.
Mhm.
We do have a lot of manufacturers that build commercial structures that are not occupied. They're utility structures, or they may be like oil pump stations or anything that's not necessarily occupied for a long a long period of time. They're just there for maintenance or doing tests. I think what we had discussed is possibly making an amendment to specifically disclose that those structures do not need to comply unless they, at least for like what was it, solar ready, or the parking, EV parking spaces.
Yeah.
But they do have to comply with the electric ready. So if they have a gas heater, that it should still have the capacity to be upgraded to a electric ready heating system, or any other gas-fired appliances that may be in those units, still would need to comply with the energy readiness
Right.
requirements of the code. So
Yeah, and I think that's helpful to highlight, Donnie. I mean, I think so, we, in my discussion with you and Sam, I think we talked about a lot of the potential scenarios in which we're talking about buildings that are outside of the norm, right? And potential exceptions to the rules that the Energy Code Board was considering. And I think what's really important to note here is that a lot of people ask me is like, well, we're not going to have parking. Do I have to install EV charging infrastructure? And the answer is no. The EV charging infrastructure is only applicable if you install parking. Same thing with electric readiness. If you're not going to have any heating and cooling equipment, or water heating, or cooking, or whatever the different pieces that are required to be electric ready under the model code, if you don't even have that equipment to begin with, you don't have to make it electric ready, because there's nothing to make electric ready. And then we had also discussed, solar readiness for some of these buildings that may not be interconnected to the grid, or may not have any electrical demand. Like if they don't use their own electricity and they're not interconnected to the grid, then it doesn't really make sense to make those solar ready either. And so I think that there are some examples of buildings where there may be exceptions, either that need to be considered. Whether they need to be written into the rules or not, I will defer to all of you on that. But I think, what I have found is when we talk about exceptions in particular, it's like we could have an entire code length of exceptions of possible scenarios that could come up. And my view is that sometimes it's more appropriate. And I know that some of the building officials, and Tim, we've talked about this, about it just makes sense of you will consider the reality of the situation in that particular case and make a determination of how those requirements apply for those odd exceptions, in case, rather than in some cases actually writing it into the code. And Tim, I don't know, since being a building official, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but.
Yeah, I totally agree with that concept. As an AHJ, is to, is this group here, the TAC, we may consider some clarifying language to accommodate those, but not get into like Adam's concept of exception after exception, but more some general language that we could try to draft up that would help move forward for the division of housing rules.
Yeah. Donnie, did that kind of address your question, comment?
yeah, I just wanted to bring it because I know that was one of the things that we talked about.
Sure.
And I know that I think Sumit, actually, that was one of the reasons why we had asked that question, is because they build structures that are similar to that.
Mhm.
And to what limitations are we going to be applying this solar and energy readiness?
Yeah. I think ultimately the goal of the Energy Office and the goal of the legislation was to require these provisions in situations where they apply, right? I mean, and it's, as we've acknowledged, it's hard to write code language that exempts every possible scenario that you could possibly dream up about buildings that may not necessarily fall within the paradigm that most buildings that we're considering do. And so I think that's where we just need to consider, like Tim said, potentially some general language or other opportunities that will allow Division of Housing to provide some exceptions in those cases where it is a non-traditional or non-considered structure type in the code as it's written.
So I think Mark's hand was up next, and I know some of this is the topic you wanted to talk about, so we'll get to you in just a second. Mark?
Well, good morning, Adam, and good morning, Tim. You brought up a very unusual, very interesting concept, saying that I deal in a lot of these equipment shelters, and I do mean a lot of them. And a lot of them are switching stations and stuff like that, where heat is our worst enemy.
Mhm.
We try to use these buildings more as a heat sink to get the heat out of the building, but we do use a lot of HVAC, and I do mean a lot. But it's not designed for human comfort. It's designed for optimal temperature for the operation of that equipment. Is this what you're talking about for the exceptions? Because this has been a kind of a, let's say, a heated topic for years on these types of buildings.
Yeah.
And then I do also deal with the oil field buildings where we may have a catalytic heater in there for optimization of the equipment, again, the sampling equipment, but the grid on the floor is wide open to the outside. So we're not conditioning the building.
Mhm.
But once again, we still got to kind of fall underneath the guidelines of the energy code, which is very difficult at times.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it is. We hear that sometimes for sure. So I think that generally speaking, what we were directed to do was to make buildings that are using equipment that is non-electric. So in the cases you gave, in the examples you gave, to make equipment that is non-electric prepared for electrification of that equipment, whether it's serving the purpose of heating and cooling for human comfort, or whether it's serving the purpose of heating and cooling for equipment. I don't think that was really differentiated between, but I do think your comment about heating and cooling in conditioned space, I think might be one of those times where we're talking about some of those potential for exceptions. So I think if we're talking, within conditioned space, I think that ultimately the statute and the code is pretty clear about what is required. And I realize it is certainly a challenge at times to meet that. And I think that that's one area where potentially there are opportunities for discussion on what are workable solutions in those particular unique cases. But I think when we're talking about working on systems that are not operating for service to conditioned space, that may fall outside a little bit of what we're talking about here.
Well, the only reason why I use conditioned space, Adam, is because the building code is very clear about it in chapter 12, what conditioned space is.
Right.
And some of those conditions, we actually have that in these buildings, like for gas samplers and stuff like that, because they have to have that temperature for the equipment to operate correctly. But is it conditioned for human comfort? No, it's actually for the operation of that equipment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still considered conditioned space at that point because it meets the building code, and for the HVAC meets the energy code stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is one of those questions we'd have to probably go back and really evaluate specifically, just because this is not, again, a situation that we deal with on a regular basis, or certainly a situation that's brought to us regularly. But I think that within buildings that are servicing where there's equipment that is non-electric, that is serving conditioned space, that generally speaking, this code would apply for electric readiness.
Okay.
I just wanted to kind of add, I think the point of the energy code is for energy efficiency, not necessarily for human comfort or anything like that. It's just for hey, you are heating the space or using this type of equipment. We want to make sure there's some kind of efficiency going on. So I don't think it directly relates to the comfort of the occupants. It's just hey, it's directly related to the equipment or the appliances that you're using within that structure. So
yeah. I think, Donnie, you're right about that. And I think thank you for clarifying. That's what I was kind of trying to get at, but I didn't say very succinctly. So thank you for saying that.
And I think if you guys heard it, Adam, is that they are open to exceptions for reasonableness, especially on the commercial side of this, for stuff that just doesn't make sense. If they're way out in an oil field and it has unconditioned space, and that might make sense to do that. And so we'll work with the Colorado Energy Office to write the rule. But it'll have to be, when the plan set comes in, it'll have to be, there'll have to be a request for an exception, I think, on the plan set.
Yeah, I think so. That sounds right to me, Sam. And I think ultimately, I just want to refer back to the provision on the first slide you shared from the statute that says amendments are allowed, but amendments are not allowed for weakening the code requirements. And I don't necessarily see exceptions for where technical feasibility is like impossible as being a weakening amendment, because it's like, well, why would you make something electric? For example, why would you make a building electric ready that has no equipment? Or why would you make a building EV ready that has no parking, right? Like there are reasonable, understandable situations in which those exceptions might exist. But I think that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we just couldn't contemplate all of those possible exceptions in the development of the code. And so that's where some of this extra, you know, language, we will have to work out, like, is this, and I think what we will really have to determine between us is this an exception for a reasonable feasibility challenge, or is this because it's difficult and we just don't want to do it, and then we're weakening the requirements, right? Like there can oftentimes be a fine line there, right? About like, we can do it, but it's hard, versus we actually can't do it.
And Mark, you brought up a really good point with respect to the chiller equipment that we see in a lot of different places, and that being the biggest problem and for heat dissipation. And so I would assume that's all running electric already, and you're pretty maxed out to size on your electrical. You should be electric ready, I think, for that. If there's any other exceptions you see that you think we need to discuss.
Almost all of it's electric ready, Sam.
I'm sorry?
Almost all of it's electric ready.
Yeah.
We very seldom have anything with the switching stations and stuff like that, unless it's a gas pack type air conditioner, because they've had to use that to get to that optimum temperature, and it's easier on the equipment. I'm just going to put it that way. But other than that, and that's very seldom.
And you're probably over insulating that around that too, to keep that cooler temp.
Correct.
Yeah.
We're using a lot of rigid and spray foams. Correct.
And that's something that's worth clarifying. And I think it may be obvious, but it might be worth saying anyway, is that if your equipment is already electric, you don't need to do anything else.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, one of the questions that we discussed with Adam as a hypothetical was a facility out in an oil field that doesn't even have electricity out there. You know, how are you going to manage that? So
because a lot of that, Sam, is low voltage. I mean, it's connected to the truck or to the facilities at the time, and there's no source of real power out there. They hook into a 12 volt or a low volt system, and that's what they run those samplers and those pumps off.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to you.
And there's two questions on the quick. One's from Tim. Are these structures typically set up to use natural gas? And I believe it's, I don't know, almost 50-50. Some, if they're connected to permanent power, I'm sure they have mostly electric, but I believe they do have natural gas and propane that they connect to.
Yeah, and just to clarify too, whenever we talk about electric readiness requirements, we talk about it's not just natural gas is certainly the most common that we see, but it's not the only fuel that we see either. And so just to be clear that it's not only systems that use natural gas that need to be made electric ready. I forget what the definition within the actual code language itself is. I have to pull that up. But I have it up here. We have a definition for like what combustion equipment is, and I can read it off here right quick. So combustion equipment is any equipment or appliance used for space heating, surface water heating, cooking, clothes drying, or lighting that uses fuel gas or fuel oil. And there are definitions for what fuel gas and fuel oil are. So just note that it's not only natural gas is, I guess, the point to be made there.
Yep. And then Tawny had a really good question on would these equipment structures still required to be solar ready? And I think that was if it depends on the size and if they, because there was a lot of discussion. I know Sumit brought this up on pretty small structures that may not have the roof space for solar panels.
Yeah, so I will note for residential construction, there is a minimum roof size that needs to exist in order to even require solar readiness. I think it's
And Adam, I'll interrupt you for just a second. This ties to Tracy and tiny homes also, on a 400 square foot structure. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so the roof size needs to be a minimum of 600 square feet in order to implicate any requirements for solar readiness for residential. For commercial, there's not actually a minimum roof size, but I will note that there are exceptions where a design professional can essentially come in and say, well, this, due to extensive rooftop equipment or, other design criteria, essentially that this building is not suitable for solar readiness, or for future solar installation, and thus can provide some exceptions there as well. So there are opportunities to get out of solar ready requirements depending on the situation of the building.
And so Tony, does that answer your question? And I think that's an important note, and Adam brought that up at the meeting we had with Donnie, is that the design professionals can exempt solar ready based on the design criteria. And I think that Tracy helps you out.
Yep, and that did answer my question. And actually, just listening, it just made me ask the question just out of curiosity. We're more residential, so we're not in the commercial space, but it was just an interesting conversation. So I thought I would throw out that question.
Yeah, and I think tiny homes definitely in particular, I'd have a hard time imagining a situation in which a tiny home is going to have a roof that's over 600 square feet in area, but.
Yep, and all right, so let's go to Sumit, and then Tracy, will come back to you.
Yeah, as a Sumit here, good morning. Kind of sounds like you pretty much answered the questions that kind of adding to what Donnie was saying earlier. Our company builds commercial non-occupied shelters, unoccupied, and they're mainly built for power plants. They're put at power plant sites, installed at power plant sites. It's an equipment shelter, less than 200 square feet. So my question was basically around what would apply to those kind of shelters, the commercial based side. So it sounds like anything less than the 600 square foot roof, there would be no solar ready requirements for those kind of shelters. And since our shelter is basically, it also meets the thermal envelope requirements in the energy code. So it doesn't sound like there'd be a lot of applications or things that would be basically is what I'm saying, from some of the solar ready and electric ready required. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, so I guess for the solar readiness, just to clarify, the 600 square foot roof size minimum is only for residential. So if these are commercial structures, then there would have to be other exceptions provided. Essentially, design professional would have to essentially make an argument to DOH that, hey, this building is not suitable for solar readiness for XYZ reasons.
And
thus we would like it to be exempted. And then you have to get approval from DOH in order to actually do that. And then as far as electric ready requirements, again, it only depends on whether or not there is combustion equipment provided for a conditioned space.
Okay, so in that case, yeah, we don't have any combustion equipment or anything like that. I mean, we have HVACs and things like that in there, but there's no combustion type of stuff installed in there. So okay, so there would be a solar ready requirement possibly. It'd have to be evaluated, I guess, but that's still a possibility.
It does depend. I mean, I think one of the examples we talked about is if there is, depending on the electrical demand of the building and whether it's interconnected and other things, as well as design criteria that a design professional could justify it not being suitable, then I think that there are a lot of potential situations in which solar readiness would not be required. But I think it's really on a case by case basis.
Okay.
And I'll caveat that from the design professionals here in the room, it's more than just saying it's not suitable. It's not suitable. Why?
Yeah, so one example that we gave, I think, is actually very common, is like extensive rooftop equipment that is necessary for the operation of the building, right? Like if you can't essentially put roof space, if there's not enough roof space on the roof to put solar panels as well as meet all the mechanical needs of the building, that's potentially one example. Another example is it's not going to receive enough incident solar radiation. Like it's not oriented in the way, or it can't be oriented in the way that would be needed in order to get solar generation. So those are just a couple of examples where you could see like people or design professionals able to make the argument. But to Sam's point, it's like there has to be a reason. You can't just have someone sign a document that says, oh, it's not suitable. There has to be documentation of why it's not suitable.
Okay.
So does that take care of your
Yeah,
question?
I think so. We'll just have to look at it and then go.
Good, thank you. Tracy?
So as we're submitting plans for approval, obviously it's going to be pretty easy to see that, you know, what we're building is well under 400 square feet, right? Or even 600 square feet. So do we have to do anything, right? Are we just automatically going to be excluded because our roofs aren't over 600 square feet? Is there going to be anything that we're required to prove or say, or is when you guys receive these plans and you see it's a 34-foot by 10-foot house and that's 340 square feet, is it like enough said? There's nothing that I've got to check off or do anything? I'm just kind of trying to understand what's going to happen.
So that's a DOH question. That's an enforcement.
Donnie, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I guess it's just, at least at this time, you know, there's nothing that states that's, you know, that's required for the solar readiness for less than 600 square feet for residential. So at least at this time, right, I guess to answer your question is it wouldn't be required.
But you wouldn't have to do anything, Tracy.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that you're exempt from the electric ready portion. You're just, you still have to comply with that. But the solar ready part of it, it's for structures that are 600 or greater. Is it 600 or greater or greater than 600?
It's 600 with not less than 600 square feet is the exact language of the code. And it's of roof area, not of floor area. So that would be even easier, I feel like, to demonstrate that if you only have a 340 square foot structure, that your roof area is less than that. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Donnie, you're up.
Yeah, just real quick. So there's about 15 of us that are probably going to return to these meetings. So maybe one of the notes that we can keep in mind when we're doing these rulemakings for the exceptions is there are low energy buildings that are in the IECC. So that can probably be one of the exceptions. If the energy code already finds them efficient enough that they don't have to comply with some of the sections in the IECC, we might be able to apply that to that exception to those structures for low efficiency structures. I know that we may be getting some here pretty soon. I know that, like for instance, I think it's Routt County or Larimer County. They get cabins that are built for their location and they're low energy buildings, right? We don't specifically amend our rules to define what a cabin is, but there are manufacturers that build cabins that meet Larimer County requirements. So there might be other jurisdictions that are like that. And do we really want to apply these to structures that are already low energy buildings, right? The other thing
are we talking about the energy requirements or the electric, solar, EV ready requirements?
I guess I guess for both, because if the structure is already efficient, does it have to be more efficient if it already is efficient, right?
Yeah. So I guess the exception I would take to your assessment there is essentially what the code requires is that if there is present those conditions, regardless of the efficiency of the building. So if it is present that there is combustion equipment on site that is serving the building, that combustion equipment must be electric ready, regardless of the overall efficiency of the overall performance of the building, as the statute was written and as the code is written. Same thing for like if parking is provided, EV ready, there must be an EV ready space in the example that you just gave for a cabin. Like if it's residential, an EV ready space must be provided if there is dedicated parking provided for that structure. So I think that is one of those situations where I would say that generally speaking, it would probably not be exempted from the readiness requirements, just because the readiness requirements are not necessarily tied only to the energy performance of the building, but also to whether or not that equipment that is being made ready exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so maybe if maybe not a total exemption, but because if it's a small structure and it's already energy efficient, the chances are it's not using large breakers. And so that even if you are using a gas fired or combustion equipment, if you're going to be replacing that equipment, you're probably using the same breaker or the same location that you're swapping out that appliance
Right.
for. So maybe it doesn't have to be an upsized panel.
Yeah. And maybe to clarify there, the language of the code, especially for the electric readiness piece, only essentially says that the electric capacity must be there to serve an equivalent electric load. So if the electric structure is already, the electrical infrastructure is already in place that could serve an equivalent heating load to what is already being provided by that combustion equipment, you don't have to do any upgrades or upsize. It's only if you were to need, like, essentially the equivalent electric system to your combustion system needs a bigger electric service, needs additional wiring, needs additional circuit breakers, whatever that situation may be. That's when you have to make it, you have to upgrade it essentially. If it already would meet the load, if you were to just switch it out for an electric equivalent, then you don't need to do anything else.
Okay. And then, so the other thing was, one of the things that we talked about is that the requirement for the amount of space needed for the solar readiness, that's an accumulative square footage, not that we have to have one slope that has to have, is it the 300 square feet? So if you had different elevations of slope, or I think we talked about possibility of, let's say a manufacturer is going to build a structure, the dwelling, and they're doing an on-site built garage that is a separate structure, but that garage might have the additional cumulative square footage needed to add the solar, or that garage is, let's say it's a pole barn or something, that it definitely has the 300 square feet, but the house is maybe not enough roof space there to do all 300 square feet. That accumulatively it can still meet the requirement.
Right. Yeah. So the allowances in the language for the solar readiness says that even though, so it only applies to homes that have a roof area of 600 square feet or larger, and you have to have within that 600 square feet or larger, you have to have 300 square feet total of determined solar ready zone area. But to your point, Donnie, it does not have to be consecutive solar ready zone area. So there are minimum dimensions, and let me go. It says it can't be any small, like each subzone. So if you want to break up that 300 square feet into 3 different subzones, you can do that, so long as the area that you break it up into isn't smaller than 5 feet by any dimension and isn't smaller than 80 square feet in total. So essentially, if you wanted to break that 300 square feet up into 3 100 square foot areas, you can do that. And ultimately you can design your roof for that, but the real goal there was just essentially to make so that someone wasn't saying, oh, well, I'm going to have this little 1 square foot area over here and this little 5 square foot area over here, and like put a patchwork together where solar panels would never really actually be able to serve any. I mean, you can't have a 1 square foot area and have a solar panel installed there, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense. And so that's really what the goal there was, is like, you can break it up into smaller areas, but the smaller areas can't be like unworkably small.
Yeah. And then the last thing, to kind of expand on your part where we're talking about the oh crap, now I forgot. I'll raise my hand again when I remember, so we get some mark.
Okay, sounds good.
And then before Mark goes, Adam, did you have a time restriction for today, or are you okay?
Nope. I can go until 10:30. Yep.
Okay, great. Perfect. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, mine's a simple one, Adam. I live in Oregon. Kind of some of the conditions that Colorado has, and when we locate some of the single family dwellings, they're surrounded by a lot of trees. And my sunlight is blocked out for most of the day. So the solar ready effectiveness for my home isn't really going to be beneficial for it.
Yeah, that's a great question that you're asking, and we have a specific exception to address that. So there's an exception to the requirement that says, one of the exceptions is a building where all areas of the roof that would otherwise meet the requirements of the solar readiness are in full or partial shade for more than 70% of daylight hours annually.
Okay.
So if your building is in that situation, then you would be exempted from the requirements.
Okay.
What was that percentage, sir?
70% of annual daylight hours.
It's real easy to do, Tracy. There's a modeler out there that IES has that you can actually model that and get your indicated sunlight for that for that rooftop. I'm curious about Tim's question about the phase 2. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, sure.
Right-
I wonder
right
if we
before
want
you
to
do
answer any
that-
other questions about
Yeah,
this.
right, Adam, right before you do that, there was the discussion that, I think Charlie brought this up. But you and I know you and I and Donnie discussed it, was, homes around a cul-de-sac, right? And the rule and the exception on, the way the roof is oriented and how much sun it gets is tough to, in a manufacturing process like for modular, the efficiency is do them all the same, right? Not pull out unit C out of A, B, C, D, and E to make it different. But do you want to kind of talk about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by, I'll just read the language of the code, and then I think we can talk about how that parses out into this. And I think we're talking specifically more in this case, Sam, for residential, right? A cul-de-sac
Yeah, on
type situation,
residential, for example, a residential cul-de-sac, right?
Yeah. Okay, so the language of the code says new residential buildings with not less than 600 square feet of roof area oriented between 110 degrees and 270 degrees of true north. So I'll just stop there. So in order for the solar ready requirements to apply, it says that the roof area must be oriented between 110 and 270 degrees of true north, right? And so only homes that have roof area that is oriented in that fashion are required to be solar ready. And so, Sam, I think one of the things we talked about is some of these properties or some of these buildings are built knowing where it's going to go, and then others are built not knowing where it's going to go.
Correct.
And I think the situation here is if you know where it's going to go, then you know how you need to orient your building in order to be solar ready, right? You need to orient it that way so that it can be solar ready. If you don't know where it's going to go, then my interpretation could potentially be, and I think this would be open for discussion, determine how it would actually work, but that essentially the code says that if you don't know that it's going to be oriented between 110 and 270 degrees, that technically speaking, it does not have to be solar ready.
But that kind of goes along with what I forgot, and that's why I wrote it in the chat, is we have lot models. And they might not know where they're going. They might be sitting at a dealer's lot for 2 years before they know where it's going. But the other thing too is I'm not sure if we have the power to say how a structure needs to be oriented, because zoning might regulate and say like, hey, this has to be a front street facing home.
Right.
And so that might actually put it out of compliance, and we can't necessarily say, no, it has to be oriented this way so it meets the energy proficiency or electric ready, solar ready requirements.
And to be clear, it's not, the code is not saying that the building needs to be oriented in that way. What it's saying is if the roof area is oriented that way, you need to be solar ready. And so what I'm saying is if you know where that building is going to go, you know the property where it's going to be, and you know what the roof orientation is going to be, and you know that the roof orientation is going to be between 110 and 270 degrees of true north, the code would say that that building needs to be solar ready. If you don't know that it's going to be oriented in that way, then that building, technically speaking, does not need to be solar ready. The thing I would note is by reading the letter of the code, essentially what we would be saying for a building that if you manufacture a building, like you said, the lot model that sits on the lot for 2 years, gets bought up and gets put on a property. What this code would say is that that building, if where it's put, its roof orientation is in the direction of 110 to 270 degrees of true north, that it needs to be made solar ready. I realize that puts a little bit of a challenge, because obviously the ideal situation would be that it's made solar ready from the beginning and not having to be modified in any way once you know where it's going to be put. What I would say is ultimately, especially for residential, and Tim, we talked about this a lot in the Energy Code Board, is that the increased requirements for solar readiness are pretty minimal. I mean, ultimately, solar readiness, there's been a lot of analysis to show that for the average single family home, we're talking like $200 to $300 per structure in order to make it solar ready, right? And so if I was advised, I think this is something that ultimately you all would have to determine as you're adopting and how this is going to apply. So I can't give you any like directives of like, this is what you must do. But ultimately what I would recommend in those situations is just make it solar ready, because if you get into a situation essentially where it's bought and then put on a property where where all of those other conditions apply, and then someone in the local building department or you all are having to say, okay, well, now it's got to be solar ready. It would just be a lot more cost effective and a lot easier to have just made sure that that building was solar ready from the beginning. Even if there are some situations where you're going to build a solar ready building that ultimately ends up on a property where solar is not ideal. That would be what I would recommend, but I think that there are a lot of folks who would have concerns about that, given that you would be you potentially putting infrastructure into a building that it doesn't need, or that you're going to essentially be pressuring people to orient their buildings a certain way. So it's a challenge. It's one that I don't know that has a simple answer.
It doesn't have a simple answer, Adam, and I appreciate your discussion on this. And I will turn to the manufacturers and the design professionals now, well, and anybody on the TAC. We will take a look at construction plans as they come through, and that we require an address if possible. But for you guys designing your construction processes and your plan sets, is this going to be, are you going to just make them all solar ready? Are you going to, or are you going to try to do it address by address, or project by project?
I can speak for us. We typically build right now address by address. So we're not doing a lot of like lot models. That being said, I don't know how it works if we get a approved set of plans from the state for a lot model and we submit that to the local jurisdiction, are they checking this angle of the house to know if it's supposed to be where would it get called after that?
Yeah. So essentially the responsibility for determining orientation would probably fall on the local jurisdiction, because it's at the point when the building is being placed rather than when it's being constructed per se.
I think
and
that's
so
sorry,
and that's go ahead, Donnie.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think what we're going to do on the plan review side is request that information up front, because if you know the site location and you know how it's going to be oriented, then you need to notify us so that we can say like, hey, you are in that degree of direct north orientation. You are required to comply with the solar readiness requirements. The only alternative to that is that if we deferred that, like we would do fire suppression systems or wildfire mitigation, are you going to have to comply with the locals energy solar or solar readiness requirements, because they might have higher exemptions, or not higher exemptions, higher requirements than what the Division of Housing approves.
Right. So, and that's the thing, is I would note, is ultimately if you leave it to the point where it gets to the local jurisdiction, one thing is that some of them might have requirements and some of them might not, right? Because it's ultimately they have to adopt those requirements before they actually apply at the local level. And so the situation you might end up in, Charlie, is that you would put the building in and then they would say, well, you got to come in and now make this thing solar ready, which is going to obviously cause, that's generally what we're trying to avoid, right? Is having to come in and rip out existing infrastructure or upsize existing infrastructure to prepare a building for solar. That's why we're trying to do it in new construction as opposed to doing it in any kind of alteration. And so I think, to Donnie's point, structuring it in a way where essentially you would know, if you know what property it's on, you know what the orientation is going to be, getting approval at the DOH level first and making sure that that is approved there will hopefully avoid most challenges with the local jurisdiction.
I'm just going to chime in there that basically eliminates the possibility of submitting a master set for a community with one plan set that can apply to 17 different lots. So that's a massive step in efficiency in terms of, like, now the state will have to review all 17 site-specific submittals rather than a master set.
Unless you just make them all solar ready.
Unless you just
Yeah,
make them all.
Sure,
solar.
but I mean, sooner or later, somebody's got to fight for the little guy who can't afford. I mean, this is one of countless add some more cost, and how do we achieve affordability when we're just allowing that to happen without any pushback? And I would highly be skeptical of $200 or $300 of additional cost per unit, when just the documentation and the process will cost at least that, if not double, just for the manpower to create the additional page for that particular stuff. Somebody in the factory to have to figure out the procurement. I mean, this is not an incidental at all. I don't think any of these things are necessarily an incidental. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not the little guy, but I'm always looking out for the little guy, from a design standpoint. And every time I see additional, processes overlaid over an already incredibly complex and expensive process for building, what should be affordable housing, in most cases is anything but that. So just my 2 cents.
And I'd like to echo, I want to echo that also. Thank you, Dean, for just raising that point. I mean, when these factories are building hundreds of units a year, that couple $100 or even more, based off of Dean's explanation, that really adds up. And that impacts our factories, that impacts our communities, that impacts the cost of these houses. So it's so important that we get it right.
And I always insert a rant at some point in these meetings to talk about the affordability. Thank you, Dean, for carrying that. I mean, this is just, again, it sounds simple, and every one of these modifications and additional requirements is always done with the best intentions. It just continues to drive up cost, and it drives out efficiencies in the construction process. You're designing a custom Camry in your driveway. That's what we're doing over and over again. And now we have to say, oh, if that Camry is going to drive on a certain road at a certain time of day, we're going to design it differently. So again, this is always my soapbox, but it isn't always simple. It's one more step in a customized, unique process for every lot. And we're just moving so far away from affordability.
And one thing, I completely agree with everything all of you just said. I don't think that what we are trying to do is not just require these things for the sake of requiring these things. I want to make that clear. And I think so if there is an opportunity or a way that this group can come up with a solution that both achieves the goal that the state is trying to achieve and increases efficiencies or makes it a smoother process for all of you and making this workable, I am totally open to considering and discussing what those potential solutions might be. All of you know your industry better than I know your industry. And so we would certainly be open to conversations, consider any proposals that you guys make. But I just want to note that what's not on the table is just saying we are not going to meet the requirements. There's state laws in place. We are responding to the state laws just like you all are. And we don't have the authority to just say, no, you don't have to do it because it's going to cost money, because then we'd have to tell everybody that, and we can't do that. And so there are requirements that we are required to meet, that you all are required to meet, that DOH is required to meet. And I think that's just, that is the situation in which we're dealing with. But to the extent that we can make it as workable, as cost effective as possible within the structures that you work with, we would love to do that. So whatever strategies, approaches, suggestions you have, please let's talk about them.
So Mark, I see your hand up, and Nate, I saw you raise your hand too. So let's go to Mark first and then Nate.
Well, mine's going to be the doom and gloom, of course. That's what I do. Adam, I got a good question for you. With the PVs, I am now going to, as a normal installation, I am now putting in an ESS system. With the changes in the 2021, we all know that that's not going to be very easy anymore. We're going to talk about the cost of raising construction on a home. These fire ratings and stuff that the 2021 is now requiring underneath the fire code are not going to be very cheap. We're talking 2-hour fire rated assemblies, fire caulking. I mean, you know, the whole deal.
Yeah.
Leslie, you can chime in on this too. But this is another thing that I'm just kind of a little bit concerned about with the requirements of making them PV ready, because most people will put an ESS system out there unless the utility company buys back the power, of course.
Right.
But putting those battery systems out on next to those homes, we could run into some problems.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you know, Mark, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. All I'm saying is that the energy storage system installations are not required by our model code, nor is readiness for energy storage required. So I just want to not necessarily to argue with your point at all, Mark, just to make it clear that that is not something required by the code, and ultimately would be a choice to decide to put those systems in concert with the solar ready requirements.
Thanks, Adam. Go ahead.
Nate?
Am I up? Okay.
You're up.
Adam, I want to acknowledge that to a large degree, you are having to write a code to enforce a set of rules that were adopted by the legislature. And while I think there's a clear consensus on affordability, and you might even join us in that, the rules are the rules. And so we're trying to figure that out. So I appreciate that. The thing I wanted to ask, and this might just be a little bit of an ignorance, is when we get into like a condominiumized project, multifamily type project, how does the code encapsulate multi-unit solar ready from the standpoint of, is it a building system? Can it be a building wide system? Does each individual unit, does a first floor unit have to have a chase going up to the roof through the next two units? Like how does it kind of encapsulate, the IBC code stuff?
Yeah, so the way it's structured now is that it would be on a building scale, that the multifamily building would have to provide the solar readiness for the rooftop area, as well as for electrical capacity to serve that solar, would be at a building scale, would not be on an individual unit scale.
But so let's take a 3-story condominiumized unit over unit building. I understand the scale of the PV would have to be, on an overall building square footage need, electrical load or whatever, but you have individual meters. So are you going to have to divvy it up and pipe it? You know what I'm saying? Does it have to be piped into each individual unit separately?
As the
Or
code
does
is
that only
written,
work if you have a master meter? You setting up the whole building.
essentially would only be, my understanding is that it would only be in the case of a master meter. It would not, each individual unit would not have to be piped into the solar system.
Okay.
This requirement, it probably derives us in a future of a single meter for every building and then electric sub-metering at the module or resident level. I mean, the technology is there to do that as well, but it's not
the
so adding more
sub metering
cost.
is not through the utility. It's kind of by the landlord system, if you will. Interesting.
And some electric providers
don't allow that.
Don't love it. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Tim?
Yeah, I could just give a comment, at least from Broomfield's standpoint, Nate. We've been enforcing the electric ready code since January 1st. I've got 3 different multifamily projects. One's a condo, and the answer that I have seen, we haven't required it, but every multifamily project, including condominium projects, have a house meter to handle everything in hallways, outside,
common area. Yeah.
And that is where the solar ready requirements, we're having the electrical engineer verify that particular service has the capacity for the future solar, and they're individually metered for each, even in the apartments, to do that. That's just what I've seen in our experience.
Okay.
here in the past,
So you're just hooking it up to one meter, if you will. It's not master metered. In that case, you're just hooking it up to the common area meter to offset that.
Yeah. Now, if
Okay.
you had a project somewhere that came in, where it was all individual meters, then I think that's a whole separate discussion with how you do that plan review. I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim, for that.
Adam, Tim,
The
do
part
you
of the
guys
challenge this year has been we haven't actually seen a lot of this in practice yet. So that's really good to hear, Tim, that that's what you're seeing.
Adam, Tim, do you guys have any return on investment for the PVs to make this more palatable for like Dean's and Charlie's end users and Tony and Tracy?
I think the problem, Mark, is it's a law. It just has to happen.
Okay.
That I mean,
Yeah, so there is some information and analysis. So I will also note that, and I've told Sam and Donnie this as well, but we are actually having some analysis being done on these code requirements to help understand the broader cost implications, return on investment implications, cost effectiveness. I will note that all of these requirements, Nate, I think you hit the nail on the head, is that they are requirements, but the other piece of it is that a lot of these requirements don't realize the cost benefits until the actual equipment, the thing that it's preparing the building for, are realized. So electric readiness doesn't realize any cost savings or energy savings or emission savings until electric appliances are installed. And I think that we just want to be really, I want to be really upfront about that is what we see, and that the readiness provisions, a lot of the cost implication here is based on the projections that the state is making about conversion over to electrification, conversion to installing solar, EVs, and trying to prepare buildings rather than going through. I mean, when we talk about affordability, if people are wanting to buy EVs, but they don't have the ability to charge it at home, which we know is by far the most common way that people need to charge electric vehicles. And given a lot of the other states' policies and direction on where we're moving with electric vehicles, if we try to go back and retrofit buildings that have not been made EV ready or electric ready in order to meet these requirements, or just meet where the market is going in 20 or 30 years, we're going to be talking about, if Dean, to your point, maybe it is more than $200 or $300, but it's going to be thousands and thousands of dollars if we're retrofitting these buildings in 10 years. And we don't want to be displacing homeowners, we don't want to be displacing tenants, and we don't want to be blocking access to these new technologies as they are coming out and that they are becoming the norm because buildings are not prepared for them. So those are all factors being taken into account for cost effectiveness, not just that initial first cost. So just want to put that out there.
Thank you, Adam. Donnie, you've got your hand up, and then I guess I need to raise my own hand here in just a second. Go ahead.
All right, mine should be pretty quick. So to Dean's point of the developments that are going to be going on in the state of Colorado and trying to meet the solar readiness requirements, we already have a requirement in rule that if there's any developments that have multifamily or commercial projects that are 5 or more units, that we have to have a pre-con meeting. What we can do is we can amend that to include developments of single family dwelling units, so that we can say, like, hey, these units for sure are going to be in the orientation, are going to be require that solar readiness, especially if they're cookie cutter type models where it's the same building, but they are going to be oriented in different directions. That maybe we can do like still do a master plan for that cookie cutter type model, but put a version in there that's solar ready and put a version in there that's not required to have solar ready, or is a little note in there that says if within this limitation needs to be solar ready. So at the factory, when they know where this building's going, they say, hey, this needs to be solar ready. This needs to have this setup, right? Yeah. But we can have that pre-con meeting just like we would with a multifamily development or commercial development when we know we're doing mass cookie cutter homes.
Donnie, does that have to be a separate approval, or can that be just a page within the same address, like same?
It could be a page. Like, let's say it's the same page where you put EV ready construction page or whatever, what you're doing for the EV readiness, and you just put in there if applicable or something like a simple note, right? Like if it's orientations within this zone, it needs to have the EV readiness, because at the factory, you know where the structure is going to go and how it's going to be oriented at the site. So at the factory, you're saying this is a EV ready, or this should be EV ready, and you're doing it at the factory. And then it's going to the site location that ready to go, right? So you don't have to do it for every single unit. But we can have that discussion up front. Like if you already have a site plan, you're like, hey, we're building 50 homes in this development. This is what it's going to look like for the site plan. These homes that are highlighted in blue are going to be solar ready. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are not required to be solar ready. So your one plan set that's a master plan already shows what a solar ready home is going to look like and what it's going to look like if it doesn't have to be, right? I think it's an easy solution.
And if we were doing, I think what Dean was speaking of as well is, you know, designing a single model home that would have, you know, meet the requirements for all Climate Zone 7. And we pick the highest rating for all of that, and we build something that's more of a standard lot model for Climate Zone 7 and below. Is if we add that page to say as applicable, that might be a easier way to get those approved.
You're talking about for like a statewide type of model? Yeah. So when we get more into that, we can kind of figure out how we want to do that. But we have to, your plans are going to get a lot bigger because, like, again, the real concern is the winter design temperature, because we go from -22 to 16. So your energy plan would be like 10 or 12 sheets just to comply with the tables that are going to be there, right? So, but yeah, it's same concept though. Like, hey, this is model A, or this is let's just say call it the Rocky Mountain model, right? Rocky Mountain model solar ready, Rocky Mountain model not solar ready, or something non-solar ready. But it's on the same plan set. You're just indicating what's going to happen when that checkbox needs to happen.
All right, we've got about 9 minutes left. There's one other topic I wanted to bring up, and actually two. One is, remember, if you have plans approved before January 1st, which will be the effective date of this rule, we have no enforcement of the new rule until after July 1st. So plan sets that come through will have now will be based on the current code set that we have adopted. The second thing is blow door test and duct test. And so we think those are going to be required. I talked to Robbie a little bit, Schwartz, by email. He thinks the Front Range has good coverage for people that can do blower door test. As you move west and more remote, there is sometimes it's kind of tough, and I think Tracy, you brought this up at one point in time, is finding people to be able to do a blower door test based on local residential requirements. But there is an initiative. Robbie's training people to do blower door testing as fast as possible statewide, blower door testing and ductwork testing, and you guys may start wanting to factor that into your cost structure for next year also. Donnie?
Just real quick, Adam, is there any federal energy code requirements? Because we do have HUD products. And I don't know why I just clicked now, but
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to have to, well, I don't know. Do we have to apply these to HUD homes that come into Colorado as well?
Yeah.
Well,
So
go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, HUD and USDA actually just both updated their requirements. I forget when they go into effect at different times for different structures, so you'd have to go look at the exact specifics. But HUD just updated their requirements for 2021, the 2021 IECC, and so did USDA. So any HUD or USDA backed projects would essentially have to meet the 2021. So it would be the same requirements that you've adopted anyway, that you will have adopted. And I think those requirements don't go into effect for, I don't know, Leslie, or I don't know if you remember the exact date for any of that, but Tawny knows. But anyway, there are different dates for when those go into effect for different property types. But I think the soonest one is maybe like a year or something. I think there's still a little bit of lead time, but
it's between 6 months and 2 years,
6
depending
months,
on the location.
Yeah, so I think when those go into effect would generally align pretty closely with when your requirements will go into effect on January 1 anyway. So
So that's the problem we're gonna have at the Division of Housing level is knowing what SAAs are approving at their level, because we only have jurisdiction of the construction if it's being built in Colorado. Although they follow the same requirements, we know what's being built in Colorado. We don't know what's being built out of state and coming here to Colorado.
Right.
So,
And I would just clarify too that the HUD and USDA requirements are only the 2021 IECC. They do not include the electric, solar, or EV ready requirements.
Okay, that's what mine was more oriented toward.
Yeah.
Do we have to make sure a HUD home needs to be solar ready, or does it need to have the electric ready requirements? Does the federal
The federal requirements are what's going to take place, or are what going to take precedent for those.
Yeah.
And that was actually clarified in law when that law passed a couple of years ago. There was the exception to the HUD code included in that. So thanks to Sean Roos, he pointed that out when we were looking at the bill. So the federal code is preemptive.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
Sam, I want to make sure we're getting back to Tim's question about talking about the next process, because I think
Yes,
there are a lot of
please.
folks. There are a lot of folks here who are definitely like, man, if we had been involved in this process, we would have maybe had some comments or shared some things that maybe changed
please do.
things, right? And so I just want to let everybody know that we are currently, the Energy Code Board, Tim and I and the rest of the Energy Code Board are working on the next iteration of codes, which won't go into effect for like little over 2 years for the state, like for local jurisdictions when they start adopting it. But then for the Division of Housing, I think it's not until what, 2030? Is that right, Sam? Yeah, 2030 is when those would be required. But we are currently in the development process. We are working with the 2024 IECC as kind of the baseline, and then looking at different opportunities within appendices of the IECC. We'll be incorporating these readiness requirements into the IECC, into our broader code. And so there are going to be a lot of opportunities to engage with the Energy Code Board over the next year and 4 months, 5 months, something like that, until September of next year, essentially. Well, really until June of next year. So I guess a little over 12 months, about 12 or 13 months. There will be a lot of opportunities to provide feedback of what you would like to see from the Energy Code Board. We're kind of at that phase right now. We're actually having a meeting on May 30th. I forget the date and time of that, but I can also drop the link to where our we have a listserv that anyone who wants to get any updates on what we're doing, if you're not already on it, I would highly suggest that you get on it. We provide regular updates on what the Energy Code Board is doing, and all the information that is about how you will all be able to engage, what those opportunities are, will be sent out through that listserv. So I am going to so that's the listserv sign up. If you're interested in learning more about what the Energy Code Board is doing, if you want to participate in our public comment opportunities, our engagement opportunities, like I said, there are going to be a lot of them over the next 12 to 13 months. And we would highly encourage all of you to engage and provide feedback to us so that we are developing the best energy code possible that is balancing, the need for affordability, which we absolutely recognize, and also making sure we're making progress on our energy and emission reduction goals. So
Adam, quick question. Is anybody actually on the Energy Board representing offsite construction? Because I mean, the bulk of today's conversation has really been about, well, we're talking about laws, legislation, and the implementation of that legislation that are all very much formed by a traditional site constructed mentality. Right. Yeah. And if you don't think like a manufacturer, you don't even know what questions to ask. And it concerns me because, I mean, can you imagine, to Charlie's earlier example, in the automotive industry, they set emissions rules based on a factory's output and things that are more oriented to the factory versus where the car goes, or if some guy decides to bore out his engine cylinders, 3 times once he owns the thing. I mean, sooner or later, if we're really going to see offsite construction realize the future that we all believe it can realize, we've got to unstitch ourselves from traditional site construction thinking and apply how can you apply the IECC, the 2021 IECC energy requirements to a factory in a systems level way rather than a site specific way? How do you do a blower door test on every home in rural Colorado? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, you're not testing Charlie's Camry in every driveway in the country. you're probably spot testing them, or you're doing something at the factory level to ensure that the factory is putting out an output that achieves those goals. I think we all agree the goals are great goals, but the implementation is where it falls apart, and it creates monumental document management problems for these factories and for the design teams and for the contractors. You have situations where people don't know who's in charge of what. If a factory delivers a home that doesn't actually have the roof, but the roof is site constructed, well, now who do we talk to? Is that the state or is that the local? I mean, we shouldn't have those kinds of ambiguities, but in systems built factory design, we should just completely rethink how those metrics are achieved.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with a lot of what you just said, Dean. I think one of the challenges, certainly of the last point you just made, is that's one of the challenges of home rule, right? And I'm not sure, I'll be really frank with you, I'm not 100% sure we can ever address, not never, but in the near future that we can address that challenge. But a lot of the other challenges I do think we can address. And to answer your original question is no, there isn't anyone on the Energy Code Board. That was the members of the Energy Code Board of who they represent were set in statute. That was not one of them. And so that we would love engagement with all of you in the offsite, construction industry, because that is an area that is not particularly represented on the board right now. So please do engage. We are, like I said, there's going to be a lot of opportunities. I mean, we have several public meetings. There's always opportunities to engage. We have public comment forms, public proposal, like code proposal forms that you can fill out and provide suggestions to the Energy Code Board. Those are all reviewed and considered. There will be all those opportunities for live public engagement. First one is on May 30th. There will be others throughout the process. And so we definitely want all of that feedback. We want to hear those different perspectives. So I would highly, highly encourage all of you to please be involved in this process, help inform us, because I think, Dean, your point is well taken. Of people who aren't in that industry, we don't even know what questions to ask, right? And so we want to know what questions to ask. And you guys are the folks who can tell us what questions to ask and help us figure out solutions to those questions. So please be engaged. That sign up opportunity, that listserv I just dropped in the chat, is a great way to get all the updates of what we're doing. I will also drop in just the general Energy Code Board page link here so that you all have it. Sorry, I'm like my mouse is getting lost here. So that's just the Energy Code Board page. There's all kinds of information about what the Energy Code Board is doing. At the very bottom, you'll see that drop-down menu that has the area where you can look for providing public comments and proposals. There's also information under the meeting materials that will help you identify when those meetings are. We will be doing a lot of outreach on when those engagement opportunities are to make sure that everybody is aware of them. So stay tuned, and we definitely would love to hear all of your perspectives on what we can be doing to make this more usable.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for the participation today. Very good meeting. Adam, thanks so much for coming. It was extremely beneficial, I think, to have you here. And so I appreciate you carving out this time. We'll do the same thing in another 5 years right before we hit 2030. All right. Dean's point is well taken. I assume that the manufacturers and Rocky Mountain Home Association will be a great resource to the energy office on the future discussions there. And with that said, I was going to try to give Kevin and Leslie just a couple minutes to talk about the 1200, 1205, and 1210, but it looks like we're over time. Your homework assignment is, and I'll send out links to look at 1200, 1205, and 1210 so that we can come prepared and ask those great questions. We did ask ICC to take a look at how our current rules line up with that. And so we're they are familiar with our rules as we move forward. The other thing is that if we adopt these as standards, they won't trump the ICC codes themselves. There'll be reference documents, or they're not as restrictive as the codes. So they'll be adopted standards, but we will have to caveat that if there's conflicts between the standards and the code set wins. And that interpretations can be done by the building codes and standards. So with that said, are there any other final comments before we stop recording?
Sam, I just wanted to ask a question. I don't know if it would be new business or not sure where it lands, but we very recently had a project up in Breckenridge that is requiring a state inspection that follows a certificate of occupancy, and this is kind of a new process I'm unfamiliar with. Is there something new happening that we need to get educated up on, or what's happening there?
Let's take that. I'm going to stop recording, and I will tell you everything you want to know about Breckenridge. That's the Justice Center project, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, stand by. Anybody else? And I think, Justin, you wanted to talk to Donnie. Is that right?
Mr. Trout.
All right. I'm going to stop recording. Thank you all. We next meeting is in middle of June, and I'll send out more information on that.